Hi there. We just want to welcome everyone to our ransomware webinar today, and we are so thankful to have gotten the number of registrants that we have today. And it's the top of the hour, but we're going to go ahead and give everybody a few extra minutes to get in, take their seats, and get settled in. And then we can, we'll go ahead and start the presentation and get going at about 3 minutes after the hour. So thank you, and we'll just sit tight here for a few minutes. Hello, everyone. Looks like we've got a nice number of everyone who's signed up, is taking their seats, and we want to go ahead and get started. We're really excited about today's conversation. We are going to be talking about something that is a huge hot button issue in the industry. Everyone has ransomware top of mind, and so we actually, under the guidance of our special guest, Philip Goodwin with IDC, is going to be able to kind of walk and talk us through some of the 5 key elements that are going to help everyone in their preparedness for fighting ransomware this year, next year, the years to come. And so we have our own Shawn Massey, who's the Vice President of Sales Engineering. And I'm going to be kind of running the kind of the MC duties here today. My name is Jordan Fouts. I am the Senior Marketing Manager for Demand Generation here in North America for ArcServe. And so we're really excited to be here today. We're excited to learn more about ransomware, learn about the threats that are out there, how to combat those. And additionally, we are really excited about the Amazon gift card giveaway that we're going to be doing at the end of the cast. Again, we've got a very full hour ahead of us, kind of in a Q&A type format. Very conversational, meaning we're going to have Phil kind of speak to us about what those ransomware threats are, how to fight them, and then kind of how ArcServe is prepared to kind of work through those. So without further ado, Shawn, can you tell us a little bit about yourself and
Sure.
And there.
Thanks a lot, Jordan. It's great to be here, and thank you everyone that has joined in to our webinar today. My name is Shawn Massey. I've been around the channel for 20 years or so. Most recently, working for ArcServe and StorageCraft for the last 12 years or so. It's great to be here. We certainly are very much joining together, banding together, if you will, against this common enemy that's out there, and hopefully we'll be able to give you some good nuggets. I'd like to turn it over maybe to Phil. Phil, can you introduce yourself and tell us your background, a little bit about your background?
Yeah, you bet. Thanks, Shawn. And it is great to be here with everyone on the call, as well as the sponsor of ArcServe. And I'm actually a research vice president at IDC. I cover infrastructure software platforms and have a special emphasis on data protection, which these days really covers a wide range of topics, and ransomware is a huge one of them. So I know that ArcServe wants to get right into the program, so let's go ahead and do it. Jordan, would you go ahead and advance that slide, please? Great, thank you. Jordan, you had mentioned at the very beginning that ransomware is top of mind for most people, and I want to give you some data to back that up. We conduct a lot of different surveys throughout the year, and I can tell you over the past 2 years that ransomware has really been either the #1 or #2 concern in just about every piece of research that we've done, primary research asking customers about this issue. And it's an issue that really is something that occupies the minds of everybody in the organization. CEOs in particular are very concerned about it, but so are CFOs, business leaders, as well as line of business. And that's because it has really become a constant in our business environment today. Simply put, everyone is affected by it. It's a threat that people operate or have to defend against on a daily basis, and that it really is nearly ubiquitous. You might think that you're in a small organization, or maybe an organization that is not in an industry that is particularly affected. I can tell you that's not true. We do a lot of studies in terms of who gets hit, and there are certain industries that get hit more than others, and we'll talk about those in a few more slides. But every industry gets hit, and every company size gets hit. And really the results that we see are pretty significant. Cyber crime is one of those things that may even require a disaster grade response. Now, I do want to say that disaster recovery is not enough. There are other things that go into it, but it is foundational. And so what we're going to talk about today really is cybercrime preparedness and establishing that foundation upon which everything else is really founded. And that really gets to data integrity and data survival. If you don't have those two things, pretty much everything else is going to be for naught. And so it's something that's really important to be able to establish that ground level. So on the next slide, Jordan, if you would. I do want to mention that ransomware is not a ubiquitous or a monolithic kind of problem. It's something that can manifest literally in hundreds of different ways. But there are three most common types of attacks that organizations will take. The first is the attack on the data, and that's the one we're going to be most concerned about today. And that's where the bad guys may go in and they may encrypt the data, they may scramble the data. In some cases, they'll delete the data, and that's mostly in the backups. And the backups can be particularly vulnerable. And so defending that backup is very important. The other types are data exfiltration or data theft. And that's where the bad guys go in and they extract the data, they copy the data from your servers onto their own. And then if you don't pay the ransom, then they threaten to put the data onto the dark web. That's also not something we're going to talk to you about today. There are some of the things that we will talk about in terms of best practices that will help to defend against data threat. But the reason it's such a problem is, if you think about it, once bad guys have the data, really, how do you then recover it? You can't. I mean, there's no such thing as recovering it. They already have it, and they haven't done anything to your data other than copy it. And it's becoming more malicious in terms of the frequency of those attacks. So again, some of the best practices that we talk about are going to impact that as well. And the third is device command and control. This is not something that the typical IT organization will have to deal with. It does affect manufacturers. It affects particularly pipelines. People have process manufacturing, things like that. But again, it's not something that will be a topic today. The consequences for ransomware can be really significant. And these are things that, again, during research, organizations tell us are key problems. One is lost employee productivity. That certainly applies to the IT organization and the impact that it has to them as they're responding to these events. But it also impacts users who may not be able to do their jobs while the systems are being recovered. It almost always results in lost revenue, as well as permanent loss of customers is another common complaint that we hear. Damage to the organizational reputation. You know, there was a time when getting hit by ransomware was really hush hush. Nobody wanted to talk about it. It really damaged your reputation. That's less so these days, but nobody wants to get hit by it. And certainly any kind of attack tends to be high profile. The other things that we're seeing that I think are perhaps even more concerning are shareholder lawsuits for negligence. Organizations that aren't fully prepared, that get hit by ransomware, have been sued by shareholders for the things that I just talked about. You know, the loss of revenue, the loss of customers, and really the business impact that goes by that. On the other side of the coin are class action lawsuits by the people who've been affected by the data breach and filing suit as a group against the organization. Now, finally, I just want to say organizations should not overlook internal threats, and some of the best practices that we talk about today will help to thwart internal attacks, but those are surprisingly common and something that shouldn't be overlooked. So on to the next slide, Jordan. I want to give some research that I think highlights much of the challenge that organizations face. And this is primary research done by IDC. And what we found is that more than 3/4 of organizations claim that they have a cyber protection playbook. In other words, they say, you know what, we've written it out, it's written, it's documented, we're ready to go. And that 90% of organizations say they have a very high degree of confidence in their recovery tools. They also tell us that 90% have some kind of level of automated recovery. And you think about that and you go, wow, that's pretty ready. People are prepared, their mind is there and they're set. But then when we look at the actual results after an attack, we find that 40% of respondents have been successfully attacked by ransomware within the past 3 years. 47% of them had to pay the ransom. So almost half of organizations had to pay the ransom, even though they had the playbooks, even though they had the recovery tools and everything set. Nearly half still had to pay the ransom. We also found that in 22% of situations, the organization had their backup attacked. And of course, if the ransomers can find a way to attack your backup and remove it, the chances of you having to pay the ransom go up dramatically. Nearly half of those organizations that we surveyed said they had experienced data loss as a result of an attack. The number one reason for their lost data was the inability to identify the correct restore point. You know, a lot of these attacks takes weeks or months to detonate. And so the point at which a specific object, a file system or a database or anything is corrupted can vary significantly from day 1 of the attack to say day 260 of the attack. And that as a result, many of the attacks are measured in days, weeks, or I'm sorry, the recoveries are measured in days, weeks, or months. And it reminds me of that adage, or I guess saying by Mike Tyson, everyone has a plan until they're punched in the mouth. And I think that's exactly what the situation is we're facing here. People think they have a plan, but you don't know what you don't know until you actually get hit. And that's what we face with these situations. So next slide, Jordan. This is another diving a little bit deeper into some IDC research. It was conducted and brought forth between my colleague Jennifer Glenn and me. And you can see here some of the details that I just spoke about. In the lower left, if you can see that red box, that's the number of people who are able to fully recover without having to pay the ransom. And we ran this on 2 different surveys that you can see here. And those surveys yielded 25% in one case and about 31% in the other case. Now, in the center panel, there is an indication of those systems or those respondents who had backups that were attacked by the ransomware. The upper orange are those that were attacked successfully. The lighter orange were those that were attacked but not successful. And you can see that half of the organizations had their backup attacked. And in the net, it was at 22% of total organizations attacked by ransomware that had their backup attacked successfully. And in the right panel, you can see that breakdown by industry. And you can see that healthcare was one of the most heavily attacked, finance, and another one, education. You know, finance, certainly it's a Willie Sutton thing. You go where the money is, and so do the bad guys. Healthcare, I think, gets hit a lot because, frankly, they don't have the luxury of time. They don't have days, weeks, or months in life-giving situations and systems in which life and death matter. They don't have the time to recover for days or weeks. And then education, because it tends to be very open. You know, you open up your educational systems to students and parents and teachers, and there are just a lot of ways to attack. So you can see here that it's very across the board and that it is very insidious. Next slide, please, Jordan. Now I want to break into a little bit about how IDC looks at this. And if you are familiar with the NIST framework, that's really where we begin. And what I'm finding with organizations as they are attempting to prepare and defend, that we have the 2 disciplines of data protection and data security. And I'm kind of an old dog in this industry. You know, Shawn said he has 20 years of experience in this. I can tell you I passed 40 years of industry experience this year. So when I look at it, I go, yeah, data protection, data security are 2 different disciplines. But increasingly, the customers that I talk to don't view it that way. They look at the totality of the attack vectors and the defense against them. And they want an integrated approach to data protection and data security. So if you go to the next slide, Jordan. What we find is that within this area, there leads into five best practices. And this is where I want to get into really the practical part of that. How do you make sure that your data is recoverable? How do you make sure that that data has integrity? And these are the 5 best practices we offer for it. The first one is to apply immutability. And we believe that you need to have immutable copies by policy that can't be changed by one person. Certainly, if there are policy changes, it needs to have 2-person authentication. But ideally, copies that simply have no way to be changed. And that's your best defense to make sure that somebody who gets into the system can't go in and compromise your backups or your copies of data. The second one is data encryption. And data encryption, of course, takes place at many levels. It takes place at rest, in flight, on the network, in the server, on the storage, on the backup copies, on the tape if you use magnetic tape. And we do recommend that encryption be applied at every level. Now, I get the idea that there are places where that overhead can seem like it's way too much, but you have to weigh that against what are the consequences of the ransomware versus the overhead. Then the third is an air gap copy. And oftentimes we get inquiries from clients who say, well, I've got a copy on the cloud, so that gives me an air gap. And while that is a good step and a good start, it doesn't mean that it's air gapped. You have to have the control path separate from the data path and have different credentials on both of those, and ideally two-factor credentials, to be able to protect that data that if a hacker does get into the system, they're not able to follow through and get to your backup copies or your copies that are on the web. Then the fourth is a 3-2-1-1 backup strategy. And I think a lot of people are familiar with 3-2-1, 3 copies to backup on 2 different pieces of media and 1 copy offsite. In this case, what we're saying is 1 copy online offsite and the other copy offline offsite. And of course, cloud can play an important role in making sure that you have that 3-2-1-1 strategy. And the last is backup scanning. I can tell you statistically, 76% of organizations are reinfected after they've had a ransomware attack. And by reinfection, I mean it's the same malware. And they typically restored it with their data. It's not a new attack. It's the same attack that's been reintroduced into their environment. So being able to scan your backups either at rest to find malware or prior to and during a restore are very important points. So those are the 5 key best practices that we recommend. And we'll wrap it up with the next slide, Jordan. And before I pass this on to Shawn, I just want to put these 4 recommendations out there for everybody out there. The first is conduct a vulnerability assessment. We need to know what are the ways that we can get attacked. War game this thing. Find out what are our vulnerabilities, but also find out what is your key data. If you have a data classification tool, use that tool to identify what is the most important and most valuable data. The second is gain executive sponsorship for this effort, because typically there is a significant investment that's required, and it does require executive sponsorship to do that. The good news is, as I said at the top of the discussion, this kind of problem is very much top of mind for CEOs, CFOs, and other people in the organization. So getting that kind of buy-in usually is not difficult. And then the third is to implement the 5 best practices that we specified for data survival and data integrity. And of course, to make the backup as a priority as you're moving forward. And then the last is to consolidate policies and protection as to the greatest extent possible. Most organizations have to deal with data silos. In fact, that preponderance is between 14 and 20. That complicates data recovery efforts. It increases vulnerabilities. So to the extent that you can consolidate that into a single set of tools, you can make your life a lot easier, reduce the risks, and make the recoveries faster. So if we go to the next slide, Shawn, I'd like to go ahead and turn this over. Sorry, Jordan. I'd like to go ahead and turn this over to Shawn and let him take it from there and give the ArcServe point of view.
Thanks, Phil. Really great stuff that you just gave. And actually, Jordan, if you could just go back 1 slide just for a second, I'd like to start on Phil's last slide. If I can just talk a little bit, this essential guidance is certainly crystal clear and brilliant. And as a person who has written many disaster plans and business continuity plans over the years, this vulnerability assessment is key. And I think, I don't know, 10, 15 years ago, if I were writing a disaster recovery business continuity plan for your organization, it would probably have been, the risk assessment section would probably be, your regular disasters, your fire, your flood, your tornado, your earthquake, your tsunami, those different types of disasters. Of course, user error is one of those, all right, and that's probably the greatest. But generally speaking, we don't. When I write it, I never write things in chances, right? Chances is probably some actuary that's working for an insurance company to say, all right, what are the chances of this? But what, generally speaking, we would write our DR plans to say what is likely, what is less likely, what is more likely, and all of the things that I just described: the fire, the flood, the tornado, the tsunami, the earthquake. Those are really less likely even today, right? And when we look at that 3-2-1, the original 3-2-1 that people practiced for all the years, that 3-2-1 was built for those type of scenarios. Those were built for the scenario of the fire, the flood, the tornado, etc. And today's ransomware, it's probably, if I'm writing a DR plan for you, I'm probably saying ransomware is likely. And the reason why it's likely is that there's not one way that people get infected. Folks are targeted and everything. So this vulnerability assessment is really key, being able to do that. And in order to do that, of course, we want to implement the best practices that Phil and IDC has laid out. And the best practices are really key. And what I find sometimes when I'm out and about with folks and networks and stuff like that is that we cannot lapse and forget things, right? Back when I worked for a solution provider, I sometimes the engineers, even at the place that I worked at, some really good colleagues that probably knew better, would take shortcuts, for instance, and when they're installing something that required a service level access, they would create that user. They would just use the administrator account, for instance. That type of work, if it's not cleaned up, it becomes very sloppy, and that becomes a huge area of vulnerability. So we want to make sure when we're doing those 5 best practices, and we're doing certainly the encryption everywhere, and we're doing it. But I would add one other thing for a best practice is that we just because it's ransomware doesn't mean you can't test for it, right? So to make sure that we are moving forward and you've covered the best practices, the next thing you should do is periodically test and make sure, simulate a ransomware attack and see whether or not you're able to go forward. So next slide, Jordan. So at ArcServe, ArcServe, we've got really just a wide variety of different products that hit different market segments. We've got everything from the SMB market that you'll see in the lower left-hand corner, and all the way up into the mid-enterprise and some into the large enterprise pieces. So we've been around since 1983. We're probably the longest lasting data protection vendor that we have out there. What I would say though is that when we are talking about data protection, is that ArcServe is undergoing right now a transformation that is not just data protection. We're looking more at data resilience, and so there's a couple other pieces when we're thinking that contribute to this problem of ransomware in particular. Number one, we're in the midst of a tsunami of data growth. Data is growing at an exorbitant rate. Most of that data is unstructured data, and that unstructured data is everything for law enforcement. Have body cams and dash cams, and we have a lot more surveillance videos, and of course the video has really taken over, even I mean, you say about TikTok and other things, right? So we have this plethora of storage requirements that are coming. And then the thing about data resilience is the ability to snap back to your normal state as quickly as possible. So a lot of times what I use as a metaphor is you've got this rubber band, right? And when your data gets compromised, that rubber band gets stretched. You know, sometimes it breaks, but it's that stretched. And if we've got a data resilience piece, when we let go of it, it snaps right back to its normal shape. That's what we're aiming towards, and that's what we're trying to do with your data, right? To get to that point where your data, you might have an event that stretches it, but utilizing good, solid tools and best practices, we can very quickly get you back to your normal shape to be able to do that. Next slide, please, Jordan. So just real quick, if I can just build out for you the 3-2-1-1 world. You know, first of all, I think there's a lot of folks that will count the first copy of 3-2 of. Okay, so let's just define what 3-2-1 is, just as a refresher course, anyways. So go ahead, Jordan, if you go ahead and build out this slide all together. So the 3 of 3-2-1 is going to be 3 copies of the data, right? And many times, as I said, you know, a lot of folks will count the production source as being the first copy, and then you take a backup of that. That's your second copy, and then you need another copy, you know, and that rounds out the 3. The 2 pieces are copies on different media. And certainly that can be, you know, tape or disc, but here's one thing I want to caution folks on. I've walked into many a server room, and they're showing off their nice shiny new SAN, their storage area network, and they've carved out a LUN to serve up all their virtual machines, and then they carve out another LUN to be the repository for their backups, right? So that same piece of equipment actually handles both. That's a no-no, right? We want to make sure that we're on different media. We want to make sure that we have copies on different platforms, so we're able to recover. And then the 1 piece is finally an offsite copy, right? So that's going to go off to some sort of a cloud. Maybe it's your own cloud, or maybe it's you know, somebody else's cloud that ends up happening. So I believe, and I'm gonna, and Phil can jump in and correct me if this is not a valid example, but one piece that ends up happening within the ransomware world, right, is that ransomware often can go hours. It can, the payload can be deployed, and it can go hours before it's undetected. And so my observation, and this is more of a Shawnism and not from any of the analysts that have done that, but my observation is the occurrence of ransomware probably has an uptick right before a long weekend. And so what I've been seeing is, like, you know, last month we had Thanksgiving, okay, and Thanksgiving is super long weekend actually. So a lot of folks had Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday off. And so on Wednesday afternoon, you know, maybe a bad actor that has been sitting on that network for weeks, you know, starts to see a lot less activity, and in the afternoon will then go ahead and deploy the payload of ransomware, right? And it can go a couple hours without being detected. And so then by that point in time, folks are leaving early to start their weekend. They go ahead and it's not detected. So then at that point, you know, that will start churning through all of those production servers, right? And encrypting and doing what it does. While it's doing that, the backup software is taking backups of those servers. And so then that encryption, that ransomware is infected, certainly in the backups that go to the software. And then as we replicate out to the internet for the last one piece, that also will end up containing. And you think about what kind of damage that could do over a 3-day weekend or a 4-day weekend. It can do, you know, quite a bit of damage. By the time that somebody comes in on Monday morning, pretty much everything is all locked up like a drum, right? So
Awesome.
so that's why
Shawn,
3, 2, 1. Yes, sir.
I'm so sorry. I wanted to jump in. I felt like I think that we were going to take all of our questions kind of at the end, but I felt like one of the questions that we got from our friend Nabosha here in the questions: how do we protect sensitive and regulated data across multiple cloud environments while managing compliance obligations, discovering where sensitive data lives, encrypting and monitoring what's important, and reducing risk while responding to threats? And I really feel like, you know, this is kind of like the stage of the conversation where you're hitting on a lot of those points where we're, you know, multiple environments, managing compliance, you know, figuring out where the sensitive data is. And I just, you know, hopefully, Nabosha, this is kind of like where we're answering that question for you. Shawn,
Yeah,
does it
I would
feel
say
like
it's not easy. You know, let's just call it what it is. It's not easy. And you know, if you go back to Phil's slides, you know, one of the biggest pieces that is there is getting executive leadership buy-in. When you're looking at the plan, we need it because it is difficult as you're going through everything to in order for that protection, right? And you're writing your plans and you're being able to do that. It certainly is not easy, but this is why. I mean, there's two things: is you're writing your plan, and then what I had said at the start of my part of the presentation is making sure that you have a good mechanism in order to test it, and to because you have to keep track of everything. You have to make sure that all the I's are dotted and all the T's are crossed, right? Because if there is a vulnerability that's out there, and now that we're seeing, you know, a large amount of ransomware attacks are being targeted, you know, they're looking for weaknesses there, and they will find the weaknesses that happen to be out there. So, but yes, good point.
Perfect. Thank you, Shawn. So I went back, and now I'm going to go back forward again. And then there's these other points here, the challenges, getting to 3211, and we're hopefully speaking to, you know, what it takes to overcome this.
Sure. So, okay, so I think where I left off was just finishing up the 3-2-1, the basic 3-2-1 piece, and why it doesn't. Nope, go back, please. And the 3-2-1 piece, where we're at is a 3-2-1 is inadequate at this point in time, and the reason why it's inadequate is that the type of threat that's coming through ransomware can be pervasive all the way through each of those different steps, right? And it can go ahead and do that. So the extra one, you know, extra one can be one of two things. It can be air gap, or it can be immutable, right? Let's start with air gap first. I know some folks, and I think Phil kind of had cautioned a little bit about this when they talk about, oh, I've got air gap like up in the cloud. You know, air gap by definition, a physical air gap is something that is not on the same network, actually can't be accessed from any network, right? So we have the proper protection that happens to be there. A lot of folks will generally agree that like tape is an air gap solution, and absolutely it is, right? I was out on site with a customer of ours about a year ago, and they were looking at our solution, and I was looking at their air gap. They were doing air gap at plan at that time. Now they had about 600 700 terabytes of data, and it takes 3 weeks for them to run all that data off to tape, right? And so the scary part is what if they actually needed data from that air gap, right? It takes 3 weeks to run it off to tape, but that's pretty straightforward. But when you start to need to take those tapes and do recovery, the recovery is going to be a long time. So air gap, it's highly manual, a lot of labor involved to go to make that happen. It is slow, right? And also the data, ultimately the data is stale. So it's only going to be your recovery point is going to be, maybe once a month, with that air gap solution. The second piece that could be good for the one, which is what we're talking about all day long today, is immutability, right? The immutability is more like if we go back to what we talked about, the worm, write once, read many, and that definition has actually, 15 years ago, worm was just worm drives that were specially made tape drives that were out there that would only be able to be written to once. Now that has been expanded. It's not just us, but actually the industry has expanded worm to include appliances that can be where the data is immutable, cannot be changed, and that it can drop off on a retention policy that's there. And so the air gap allows really more of that. I'm sorry. The immutability allows more of that resilience, right? So you can be very easily and very quickly be able to come back from that that infection. So next slide, please. So with ArcServe, we do have immutability. We have immutable storage, and we call it the OneSafe. The OneSafe immutable storage, basically, it's our proprietary software, and the data, when it gets written, but our file system is being presented actually as a service. So the data is far below far below the operating system. So it is once it gets written, it is only read only. So it gets written to the share as we take our continuous snapshots, and they start every 90 seconds, right? That we're doing that. The snapshots kind of go through there. All the snapshots end up being read only. And ransomware comes in, and let's say, it looks at a share and it says, okay, I'm gonna go ahead and encrypt everything in this share. It'll look like it's encrypted, right? But when it's encrypted, it's not actually encrypting, the actual data. That's actually gets written out in a different spot on the disk, right? So it allows us then, we can go back and we can promote a snapshot. Anything from, our retention policies is going to be in hours, days, weeks, months, or forever, right? So you can go through, you can look at the snapshots themselves to see, at what point in time that you want to be able to do that. And within a minute or so, I'm able to promote that snapshot for a nice, clean, instant restore. So that way you can get back up and going, right away. Next slide, please. Just briefly on the OneSafe. The OneSafe, this is object-based storage, and we like to say, you can, pay as you grow, because you don't have to project what you need, right away. But basically, each one of these units can be in up to a cluster of 7 units, right? And so we've got a variety of different sizes there. Each node, right? For instance, the base node be 96 terabytes or 144 terabytes or 216 terabytes raw. And then when you look at the maximum capacity, and that's where you are filling out that whole cluster or ring, it can go up to a 1.5 petabytes, right, of data raw. So it allows you to be able to grow out. And we would consider this to be secondary storage, right? So it's great for your backups. It can be good even for like a file server replacement or NAS consolidation or something like that. But it allows you to very, inexpensively approach this problem in a very good manner. So next slide, please, Jordan. So I'm just going to go through a couple of the, we got 4 use cases here. If you are a company that has multiple NAS appliances, and what happens typically is you'll deploy a NAS, and then all of a sudden you grow it up to, you run out of space, and then you deploy another one and deploy another one and deploy another one. This is a great way to be able to really consolidate that. And then plus you're adding that immutability feature on top of that that allows you to recover in the event of a ransomware attack. Next slide. This is also another great story for us is secondary storage, right? So secondary storage, you have virtual machines that you need to archive. You have maybe surveillance cameras or video or whatever. You want to get it off of your high dollar storage area network, your high dollar disk. You can move that over to the OneSafe, and it allows you to manage that a lot cheaply, actually. And then the backup target on the next slide is a way that you're able to send. You can send your backups right directly to our OneSafe. And if you're using, a different vendor, like Veeam or Commvault or Veritas, we're agnostic to the vendor, so you could send it right to us to be able to do that. And then finally, on the next slide, this is the 3, 2, 1, 1. The additional 1 is when we're actually acting as a backup archive. So you already have, like in that graphic that we have, you're sending your backups to your backup repository, and then we'll copy that backup off to the immutable storage, and it's on-prem, and it's ready to go. In the event that something goes sideways in a very bad way, we can very quickly recover from that. Next, please. Okay, with that, would love to be able to entertain if Phil, maybe you can turn your camera back on, and if there's any other questions, Jordan, that you're seeing for either Phil or I, we'd be happy to address some of those.
Sure, and you guys have been great to answer the questions that have come through. We had some great ones, and I think some meaningful responses. One more from our friend Nabosha, and I hope that I'm getting that name right. I like to pride myself in pronouncing names properly. But one question: how to protect sensitive and regulated data across multiple cloud environments while managing. Okay, so no, we did answer that one. How can we speed compliance activities using a simplified technical environment and pre-built templates for regulations? That's like a very, very specific thing, it sounds like. But if one of you would be willing to take that.
Can you ask the question again? I don't know if I got that.
Sure. Question is, how can we speed up compliance activities using a simplified technical environment and pre-built templates for regulations?
I'll jump in on that one a little bit, Jordan, and I think it does relate to the first half of the questioner's query, and a lot of that comes down to data classification. When you're dealing with different types of data, the value of the data and things like that, these data classification tools, which are sometimes separate tools, but oftentimes built into the data protection environment, can be very helpful. Now, data classification, we find, has really 2 primary use cases. One is from a data protection standpoint, knowing what data needs to be backed up by what policy to what location, how it needs to be copied, whether it's encrypted, whether it's put into an immutable storage and things like that. All depends on the data type. So it is that data classification. The other side, or the other use case, is data value. And it gets back a little bit to the thing I talked about in terms of data exfiltration. Our research shows that during data exfiltration, about 80% of the data that the bad guys steal is useless. You know, it has no value for whatever it is. You know, like you steal my MP3 files. Okay, have fun. I don't care if you post them on the dark web, but it's data classification tools that can tell you whether they have value or not. And so those are the two key use cases, and that ties into the governance. So knowing what data it is, the nature of that data and the value of the data are really where you start with governance. Templates are a part of that, of course, but I think it all gets down to data classification. I don't know if you want to add anything to that, Shawn.
No, I think that's I mean that's a good solid answer. So
That's a tremendous answer, Phil. Thank you very much for filling in those cracks for us. Let's see, one more question. Does OneSafe regularly scan backups for malware? It's possible that ransomware can sit on servers for quite some time before being activated, so it's possible local and offsite backups are infected without the admin knowing. Shawn,
yeah, the OneSafe does not. You know, what you are able to do with the OneSafe though is that you can go through the different snapshots, and you can look, you know, certainly if it's inside the backups, we would need to get inside the backups in order to view. And I think Phil had covered that also in his slide deck to be able to do that. But the OneSafe itself is not doing any particular scans. Now, if you're utilizing our you know, one of our UDP appliances, our data protection appliances, or even UDP comes with our OEM agreement with Sophos of being able to do Intercept X. What that's hopefully doing again is guarding your backups from getting encrypted, right? So Intercept X actually would hopefully see, you know, bad patterns that are happening on that server, the RPS server, and then we'll quarantine that out. But right now we don't have any type of scanning specifically on the OneSafe itself.
And what I would add to that, Shawn, is most of the implementations that I've seen use third-party software designed specifically for that malware scanning and detection. So, you know, if you're using OneSafe, you know, I don't know the details of how you interface directly with that or the APIs or anything else, but normally people will use a third-party piece of software to do that.
Yeah, perfect. Thanks.
Perfect. Thank you. Other questions? How can we balance flash data storage features and performance with cost for our enterprise workload needs? We can request a quote and see how secure managed file transfer solution can fit into our organization's IT and cybersecurity budget.
That might be on your side.
Would you mind reading that again? That seems to be a lot there. So.
Sorry, and Nabosha, again, thank you for the many wonderful questions. It sounds like there might be an offline conversation here to be had, but how can we balance flash data storage features and performance with costs for enterprise workloads?
Yeah, so I mean, I understand what they're saying. Like for instance, you know, when we look at, like for instance, the OneSafe is clearly, from a performance standpoint, is clearly going to be secondary storage. Certainly, if you have flash storage, I mean, you're paying a premium on that flash storage. So I'm not exactly quite sure where the question as far as balancing your performance on that, and I'm sure the cost is a part of that. I think though, what I would say is that regardless of what your requirements are production wise, that you need to make sure that you have best practices against ransomware built into your equation, right? So, that's where, you look at the immutability, you look at the air gapping to make sure that you're able to recover from regardless of what you're able to do. And again, not to beat this over the head, this is why when you'll need to build friends within your executive leadership team to make sure that ransomware, that your ransomware, your pre-response, if you will, or your ransomware response is a priority, and to make sure that it is funded. Because if that is not funded, then I think things actually can go sideways. And if I could just tell just a real quick story, many years ago, I became aware of a college, a small college that went down. Their network went down about 10 days before school started, and they were utilizing an HP MSA SAN, and they had a controller that died that took the SAN, and that SAN had all of the virtual machines on. It was out of warranty, and it took them probably a good 10 to 12 days in order to get a replacement part. They got that replacement part up and everything is going, right? And then the IT director, who I knew, there was always they did a post-mortem, and he went in front of the college's president's cabinet, which is all the VPs and the president, to kind of talk about, well, here's what happened and this blah, 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 blah. And they said, okay, well, what can you do to prevent this in the future? He goes, well, we can make sure that everything's under warranty, right? Makes sense. And the second thing, and then he said it was kind of off the cuff, but he said, yeah, and also this SAN supports 2 controllers. So could it be active? And if we did that, then even if one goes down, we'd be up. And then as soon as he said it and the words left his lips, one of the VPs said, okay, why didn't you do this to begin with? And that which he answered, I didn't have the money. I didn't have it in the budget. Which then they said, you never made us aware of the risk, right? So we want to make sure that as we're in our IT, domains, that we as IT professionals are constantly making sure that the leadership knows all the risks that are up there. Because if you're just looking at your own budgets and you're looking at what you're able to do in your ransomware preparedness, and your budget doesn't have enough in order for you to make sure, and it stays with you, then I think you're culpable. But making sure that you engage others into, hey, this is really a risk, and we need to make sure that we shore up all of our cybersecurity pieces. I think that ultimately will serve you well.
Shawn, I think that's a really powerful statement. I think that speaks volumes. These threats are not getting smaller. If you guys obviously have been reading our emails leading up to today's discussion, the first half of 2021, there were twice as many cyber attacks and ransomware requests as there were in the entirety of 2020. And I can't imagine what 2023 holds in store for us. So super relevant, super important, impactful. So thank you for sharing. We have reached kind of my favorite stage of today's cast. We're actually going to give away that $300 Amazon gift card. You guys are troopers. Thank you for sticking it out with us. We made you wait it out. Today's winner is actually going to be Amanda Husky. She's still on the call. She joins us from Greensville County, Virginia. And so we are very, very excited to get that shipped off to you. And Phil, we cannot tell you thank you enough. This has been an amazing engagement. Really just super poignant and helpful insights that allow us to really kind of showcase what ArcServe has to offer. So
It's been
again,
a pleasure being with you, Jordan. It really has.
yes, likewise. This is, truly memorable for us. After the cast, we are going to put out an on-demand version. You can keep it, listen to it, fall asleep to it at night if you want, go for a walk with it, check your notes. A lot of just great nuggets of information in here. So, Phil, thank you again for everything. We did have one person ask who's the winner. It was actually Amanda Husky from Greensville County, Virginia. So, yeah, sorry, I should probably have repeated that. So, thank you all. There's going to be kind of a recap that's going to be made available here shortly. Everybody enjoy the rest of their beautiful Tuesday afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you, Jordan. Thank you, Phil, for joining us. Thank you, everyone, for joining
Thanks,
our
Shawn.
webinar.